our February Salon and Saloon lecture. Tonight via Zoom, we are really pleased to be able to welcome friends and family from all over the United States, as well as we've gone international tonight. A shout out to Annette Gray, who is in Canada joining us tonight. So we're really glad you could all be with us tonight. We are the docents and volunteers of Presidio San Agustin Museum in Tucson, Arizona. For those of you that are not familiar with Tucson, the Presidio San Agustin is the beginning of the city of Tucson. The Spanish fort was actually the start of our city of Tucson. As docents, once we had finished our formal training, we decided we didn't want to stop learning, and that's where this lecture series came about. So you may kind of wonder about the name of it. You see, before COVID, we actually met in a pub across the street from the museum, hence the Saturday Salon and Saloon. So tonight we are going to keep up with the tradition of our learning in the salon, and we invite you to do your own saloon tradition at home this evening as you join us. We have a couple of thank yous I just want to put out before we get started tonight. First and foremost, a shout out to our lecture committee, John Bird, Monica Smith, Doug Klein, and I'm Jean Baxter. We also want to do a big thank you to one of our sponsors for advertising, that's Tucson Lifestyles Magazine. And the greatest shout out tonight is to Kate Avalos. Kate is our tech guru. And we're going to invite you tonight, if you have questions for Bill, to go ahead and use the chat feature on Zoom, type in your questions. Kate will monitor them. And then at the end, Kate will read the questions off after Bill has finished his particular thing. I'm going to ask Kate to put up Stan Martin's poster. I just want to give an announcement about next month's that we're going to be doing. Stan, this says 96 years and still rolling, and I know you're out there tonight. Stan is not 96 years old. He's going to be talking about the wonderful Tucson Rodeo Parade and Museum that we have here in town. It is the rodeo that's 96 years old, not Stan tonight. So, but we just want to make sure that's coming up on Saturday, March 20th. Just kind of mark your calendar. It's going to be a really special evening for that one as well. Now let's go ahead. We're going to take a look at our wonderful speaker for tonight. Let me tell you a little bit about Bill. Bill actually retired in 2012 after 28 years in law enforcement, mostly along the border. He's the former sheriff of Hidalgo County, New Mexico. He also has worked for the U.S. Forest Service in the Chiricahua Mountains. He's currently president of the Cochise County Historical Society, and he's on the board of the Arizona Historical Society's Southern Chapter. He lectures frequently on the Chiricahua Apaches at colleges and historic societies, and he's also the author of his new book, The Chiricahua Apaches, A Concise History. He and his wife, Jill, live on a cattle ranch near Portal, Arizona, and they own the 4-bar cottages. We are really thrilled to be able to bring him to you tonight. So ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, Bill Cavaliere.
Thank you, Jean, for that very nice welcome. I sure appreciate it. I mentioned just a little while ago, I don't know if everybody heard me, but I feel particularly honored to have Bill Bradford watching tonight. He is not only the Attorney General of the Chiricahua Apache tribe, but a Chiconan of the Chiconan band, and I believe he told me the great grandson of Naiche, who is the subject of my talk tonight. So that makes this particularly a real honor to have him watching. So anyway, anybody that knows me knows I am very computer illiterate. So right now on my screen, I just see faces of a lot of different people. So I need to get to my PowerPoint. So Kate, can you tell me where we go from here?
Yeah, and once again, go down to the bottom of the share screen.
Okay.
And then do you see your PowerPoint there?
Do I click on share screen?
Yeah.
Yeah, do you see it?
Yes, and then remember, click on the PowerPoint so you can use your arrows.
Okay, gotcha. Okay, my presentation, of course, is called Naiche, the last hereditary chief of the Chiricahua Apaches. Um, Naiche's father was Cochise, and Cochise had two sons, Taza and Naiche, and Taza was the older of the two sons. Naiche was born in 1856 to the Draconan band of the Chiricahua Apaches, probably in the Dragoon Mountains of southeast Arizona. His father was, of course, Cochise, and his mother was Dostase. Now, you wonder how we come to that year, 1856, where we say we know that Naiche was born then, when the Apaches did not have the calendar system that the Europeans had. They didn't, of course, have birth certificates or anything like that. Well, there was the infamous Bascom affair that took place in 1861, and there were quite a few people involved in that, and a lot of the soldiers and the Anglos who were there said that Cochise came with his little boy who was 5 years old, and that was Naiche. So going back 5 years from the Bascom affair, we could place his date, his year of birth, at 1856. This is a photograph of Naiche taken by frontier photographer Ben Wittick in 1882. This is probably the most famous photograph of Naiche. It's very iconic. Naiche was known as being very quiet and very stoic, which is kind of ironic because the name Naiche, or Naiche, the way the Apaches pronounce it, it translates to troublesome or meddlesome, and yet he was, contrary to his name, he was very quiet. And he was, white people who met him, you always read two words they always used after meeting him, the words tall and the word handsome. There was always a general agreement that he was very tall for an Apache. The average height for a Chiricahua was about only 5'5", and Naiche stood, I've read anywhere from 5'11" to 6'2", so he was very, very tall for an Apache. Naiche's father, like I mentioned, was Cochise. There is no known photograph of Cochise. This is a statue, a bust that was done of him, and the way the the artist got the idea for the face was because everyone that knew both Cochise and Naiche said that Naiche looked just like his father. He bore a very strong resemblance to him. So this is how we ended up with a statue of Cochise. Now, I mentioned the Bascom affair. This was in February 1861. This is a very famous incident, and I'm sure a lot of the people watching tonight already know about what happened. But in a nutshell, what happened was a little boy by the name of Felix Tejas was kidnapped from his stepfather's ranch. His stepfather was John Ward down in the Sonoyta Valley south of Tucson. And he was kidnapped by Aravaipa Apaches. Now, John Ward went to Fort Buchanan and reported the kidnapping. Some cattle were taken as well. Lieutenant Bascom was the one who responded to the incident. Bascom had only been an officer for 2 years and had no prior experience dealing with Apaches. Because Cochise's name was so famous, he just assumed it was Cochise who was involved in the kidnapping. So he rode out to Apache Pass with his soldiers, and they set up camp and sent out word that they wanted to meet with Cochise. Cochise shows up the following day and comes into Bascom's tent with his wife, 5-year-old Naiche, his brother and nephews. Now, the fact that he came with his wife and his child kind of tells you right there that he wasn't expecting any trouble. Bascom had the tent surrounded by soldiers. The Apaches were unaware of this. Bascom accused Cochise of kidnapping the boy. Cochise not only denied it, but even offered to help find the little boy. Bascom called Cochise a liar and told Cochise that he was a prisoner. Cochise lost his temper, pulled out a knife, slit the tent open, and ran out. And in the Apache culture, that incident is known as the cut the tent incident. Um, and what happened after that, there was this back and forth where hostages were taken by the Apaches, and they wanted Bascom, Cochise wanted Bascom to turn the family loose. Bascom refused. Cochise killed his white hostages, and Bascom had Cochise's brother and nephews hung. He didn't need Cochise's wife and little boy Naiche, so he turned them loose. So the Bascom affairs, which started about 11 years of bloody warfare between the whites and the Chiricahua Apaches. Ulysses Grant, when he was president, he was receiving a lot of concern from the governor of Arizona about all of the white settlers being raided and killed by the Apaches. And so Grant wanted a peace treaty made with the Apaches. He wanted all these problems to end. So he sent General Oliver Howard to locate Cochise and agree to a peace treaty. Again, this was in 1872. So Cochise met with General Howard, guided by Tom Jeffords, Cochise's only white friend. And Howard had a lieutenant by the name of Joseph Sladen. And Howard and Sladen stayed with Cochise and his warriors in the camp of the Jaconan Apaches in the Dragoon Mountains for over a week. And he kept a journal, which is an absolutely fantastic book. If you've never read a book called Making Peace with Cochise, I would really recommend it, by Ed Sweeney. It has Sladen's journal in it while they lived with the Apaches. And the upshot was that they sat on a flat rock, Cochise and Howard, and they agreed to a peace treaty. Howard wanted the Apaches to move to a reservation, and Cochise said, well, I have a counteroffer. We'll agree to that, but why not make our homeland the reservation? Howard agreed to that, so everybody was happy. So the Chiricahua Apache Reservation came into being. For years and years, no one knew where that flat rock was. And in 1895, by this time, Cochise had passed away and Howard had passed away, but Tom Jeffords was still alive, and a journalist from Los Angeles, her name was Alice Rollins Crane. She tracked down Jeffords and she asked him if he would take her to that rock, and he brought her there. And so in 1895, she took a photo of the rock, and that's this photo that you're looking at now. It was like a needle in a haystack trying to find it. And if you go into Dragoon Mountains, it's on Forest Service land. There is a sign that says Council Rocks, but that was put up before the actual rocks were found, so it's not at the right spot. So here it is today, the same place where Cochise and General Howard sat on the rocks and agreed to the peace treaty. Cochise passed away 2 years after the treaty was signed in 1874. They think he died of stomach cancer. He was lowered down into a crevice somewhere in the Dragoon Mountains. Tom Jeffords, his white friend, was there, and the Apaches all swore they would never reveal where the location of the grave is, and to this day, no one knows. Cochise's son, Taza, became chief after Cochise passed away. And for many years, they thought that this photo was Taza. It was identified as Taza, and it appeared in many books. And then someone found the original, and it turned out, after all these years, it's not Taza. It's actually another Chiricahua by the name of Noche, who was the sergeant major of the Scouts. So we're right back to no known photograph of Taza, just like his father, Cochise, no known photograph. So Taza became the chief. And a couple of years after he became chief, he went on a goodwill trip to Washington, D.C. with John Plum, the Indian agent. And unfortunately, he developed pneumonia while in Washington, D.C. and died there. And he's actually buried in the Congressional Cemetery. Unfortunately, the sculptor who made his headstone used the photo of Noche to put on the headstone. And so, excuse me, This is a photograph of the actual headstone at the Congressional Cemetery in Washington, D.C. So after Taza died in 1876, Naiche assumed the position of the hereditary chief. Um, it was kind of agreed on that Naiche was not as strong a leader as his brother Taza, and certainly not as strong a leader as his father Cochise. In 1876, the Chiricahua reservation was disbanded by the government. There was an incident where the Chiricahua Apache named Pionsonne visited a man named Nick Rogers and bought some alcohol from him, which was illegal to sell on the reservation. And so the next day, Pionsonne went back to Nick Rogers to buy more, and Rogers refused. So Pionsonne shot and killed Rogers. This was the official reason that the government gave for disbanding the reservation, but the actual reason was there was a lot of pressure on the government to open it up to the white people because there was a lot of ore there that the miners wanted to access to, and grazing and lumber and things like that. So anyway, it was disbanded, and all the Chiricahua Apaches were moved to the San Carlos Reservation. The San Carlos Reservation is a pretty dismal place, very, very hot in the summer. The Gila River flows through there, and the Apaches started dying of malaria. So Naiche and some of the other Chiricahuas fled the reservation on September 30th, 1881. And this is when Naiche started teaming up with Geronimo. And it's interesting because Geronimo is very well known. He gets a lot of the press. The media was always throwing Geronimo's name around. And the fact was he was never a chief. And Naiche, because of his quiet personality, a lot of them never even mentioned his name. Finally, in March of 1886, Naiche and the other Apaches met with General George Crook about 30 miles south of the border at a place called Canyon de los Embudos, which translates to the Canyon of the Funnels because of the funnel shape of the rocks there going into the canyon, the cliffs. And photographer C.S. Fly was present. He took some really remarkable photographs, including this one. And that's Naiche, of course, on the horse on the right. And left to right, standing is Perico, and then Geronimo on the horse, Naiche, and then Tisna. Now, there's, I think, 18 photographs that Fly took, and I've looked at every one of them and looked at the configuration of all of the clothes that the Apaches are wearing. Some of them had on white shirts and black pants, or black shirts and a white vest. Only Naiche was wearing a long black coat and white pants with a leather strap across his chest that held a telescope on it. And that comes into importance in just a little bit. This is the famous photograph by C.S. Fly of the negotiations for the surrender. Geronimo sitting left, and General Crook is second from the right. Everybody in this photo is identified, by the way. There's a couple of Apaches, you can see the tops of their heads, but we don't know who they are, but we know they're not Naiche because they're not tall enough. So a lot of historians ask, well, if this was such an important incident where they were negotiating surrender, where was Naiche? We know from the Army accounts he was there because at one point, things got pretty heated during the negotiations. There was a lot of arguing, and the soldiers mentioned that Naiche raised his hands, and that's all he did, and all the Apaches instantly quieted down. So if he was there, why isn't he in the photo? Well, it turns out that this is actually the second photo of negotiations that C.S. Fly took. He took one prior to this, and he forgot to pose everybody. You could tell in this photo, everybody is posed. They're either looking directly at the camera or they're in profile. So let's look at the first photo that C.S. Fly took. Now you can see that this is a really terrible photo. Everybody has their back to the camera, they have hats on, but look who's right here in the very front with his back to the camera, with the long black coat and white pants and the leather strap. We finally found Naiche. Well, after the surrender in Canyon de los Embudos, the Apaches changed their mind and they reneged on the surrender and they escaped. So they were on the run again for another 6 months until September 4th, 1886. They finally surrendered, this time, the final time, to General Nelson A. Miles in Skeleton Canyon in the Peloncille Mountains. There was no photographer on this trip, on this surrender. The Army officers knew it was a very historical and significant event because every other tribe in the United States from coast to coast had already surrendered. The Chiricahua Apache were the last holdouts. And when they surrendered on September 4th, 1886, that forever ended the Indian Wars in the United States. So Miles ordered the soldiers to make a monument and pile up rocks right where the surrender took place. Now, this is a photograph of a rancher by the name of Ross Sloan and his wife Zelda. It was taken in, I believe, 1924. And that's a pile of rocks that they're standing at in Skeleton Canyon. Now, that pile of rocks is still there to this day. It's on private property, and it's there's a lock gate, and no one is allowed to go. Prior to the current owner, I used to take tours in there, and the pile of rocks is still there. It's a lot smaller. I guess a lot of people would steal some of the rocks as souvenirs, but it is still there. So from Skeleton Canyon, the Apaches were taken to Fort Bowie and eventually put on a train for imprisonment in Florida. This photograph was taken at Fort Bowie right before they were put on the train. And I find it really interesting. You could see the Apaches standing there mixed with a lot of soldiers and a lot of civilians, a lot of curiosity seekers. And this represents the way the media back then, the newspapers, thought of the Apache. You know, Geronimo had that name of the, you know, there were all these incorrect terms, bloodthirsty savage and red devil. And here's Geronimo standing right in the center. And they didn't really care about Naiche because he was too quiet. And here's Naiche under the porch, standing to the left in the white shirt. And that suited the photographers just fine. All they were really after was Geronimo. While they were en route to imprisonment in Florida, the train stopped for, I believe, 6 weeks in San Antonio, Texas. And this shot, the Apaches were allowed to get off to rest. And we see Naiche sitting down in the front row, right in the center. And third from the right is Geronimo. And again, all of the Apaches in this photograph have been identified. This is an interesting photo because you get an idea of how tall Naiche was. There he is standing second from the right. And again, this was during that period while they were in San Antonio. Now, why were they in San Antonio for a month and a half? Well, Grover Cleveland was president. And he got to thinking after he got the telegram that the Apaches had surrendered and were on their way to imprisonment, he might not want them in prison. He thought that he might send them back to Arizona to the civil authorities to be tried in court for murder. And fortunately for them, he decided to go on with the imprisonment. That may sound harsh, but we all know that if they went to Arizona for trial, I'm pretty sure I know how the trials would have turned out. This is a very interesting photograph. It has Naiche and his wife and 3 of his children, but standing to Naiche's right is his mother. That's Cochise's widow. Now, we have no photograph of Cochise, but there's a rare photo of his wife, Dostase. And so, interesting photo. Naiche, his wife, 3 children, and his mother. Naiche had 3 wives. Polygamy was accepted by the Chiricahua Apaches, and he had, with his 3 wives, a total of 21 children. Now, not at one time. Several of them died at infancy. Several of them passed away as children, but all told, there were a total of 21. So they were eventually sent to Fort Pickens, Florida as prisoners of war. And the Apaches, of course, are a culture living in the high desert and the mountains here in the Southwest, and suddenly they were at sea level in the humid air of Florida. And it could have been worse. They may as well have been given a death sentence. They began passing away at an alarming rate. And so General Crook actually and Captain John Burke came to their rescue, so to speak, trying to get them moved out of Florida. And so the government moved them out of Florida, and but where did they move them to? Alabama. So Alabama turned out to be even worse than Florida. The deaths came at an even faster rate. Unfortunately, they were at Alabama for 7 or 8 years. And by this time, General Crook had passed away, but Captain Burke was continuously trying to get them moved out of there. He knew that it was a real death sentence. So back then, Oklahoma was known as Indian Territory. So he recommended they be moved to Oklahoma. Well, remember, they surrendered to General Nelson Miles. Well, before we go into that, here's a photograph of them in Alabama. And here's Naiche standing right in the center in the white shirt with his arms folded. And this is an interesting photo. All the Apaches here have been identified. Geronimo standing to Naiche's left. There's a man in the background to the right wearing a white straw hat. And he's not an Apache. His name was George Ratton, and he spoke fluent Apache, and he was their translator and actually became an advocate for them and traveled around with the Apaches no matter where they were moved to during their years in prison, and married an Apache woman, George Ratton. On the far right, there's Chato. Everybody here has been identified. While they were at Mount Vernon in Alabama, they had the opportunity to enlist as scouts. Now, this is a really interesting situation because they're prisoners of war, but they're employees of the government carrying weapons. Now, they were not allowed to be used as scouts off the Mount Vernon facility. Here's a photograph of them. There's Naiche kneeling in the bottom left. He eventually rose to the rank of sergeant with the 7th Cavalry. And they, as scouts, learned trades, carpentry, things like that, and they were taught English. They also did the regular routines of the military, the drills and target shooting and things like that. Very unique situation. Okay, here's what I was referring to a little while ago. General Nelson Miles, when he heard that Burke was wanting to move them to Oklahoma, he said, if they're transferred from Mount Vernon to Fort Sill, there would be practically nothing to prevent them from returning to the mountains of Mexico. A little bit of a overly exaggerated statement there. So eventually they were allowed to move to Fort Sill, and they fared quite a bit better at Fort Sill. They were given a herd of cattle, and here's a interesting photograph of Geronimo and Naiche as they were tending the cattle. And I like this photograph because it's autographed by both of them. Now, Naiche Christianity at this period, and it wasn't something he was wishy-washy about. His conversion was total, and he took the name Christian Naiche. So you see on the bottom underneath Geronimo, it has his name in those really crude block letters, and vertically up along the side of the photo, you see that in that beautiful cursive handwriting, it says Christian Naiche. Something else I like about this photo too is I was able to figure out Geronimo was left-handed because the rope on the saddle is over on the left side. Now here's an interesting quote Naiche made to General Hugh Scott in 1911. He was still chief of his people, and he wanted the best for them. And he told General Scott, "We want to be given land somewhere that would be our homes. We don't think of anything else. All we want is to be free and be released as prisoners, given land and homes that we can call our own. That is all we think about." Here's another quote from the same meeting he had with General Scott. He said, "I'm an old man now. You took me from place to place and brought me here. Give us our homes where we can take care of ourselves and make our own living." What's interesting about this quote is you see the last sentence, well, we could take care of ourselves. He didn't want the government taking care of them, make our own living. They didn't want these handouts where they had to stand in line and be given rations. So in 1913, the Chiricahuas were freed from the prisoner of war status. And they were given the option of staying at Fort Sill or moving to the Mescalero Reservation in south central New Mexico. They wanted to go back to Arizona, but the government of Arizona said absolutely not. So in order to go to Mescalero, they had to ask permission. And this was where Naiche had asked permission, and it was authorized by Major Good. And in this telegram dated March 25th, 1913, he's recommending Naiche be given permission to go on to Mescalero. So General Fitzhugh Lee was the one who really advocated for the Apaches to obtain their freedom in 1913. So they were freed, and some stayed in Fort Sill, and we'll get to that in a little bit, how many stayed there and how many went to Mescalero. But on April 4th, they arrived. And here's Christian Naiche with his grandson, Sterling Naiche, along with the minister of their church. He belonged to the Dutch Reformed Church. And unfortunately, back then, they would dress the children up for the tourists in these Hollywood-type buckskins with the headdresses on that were not ever worn by Chiricahua Apaches. And I mentioned earlier that Naiche converted to Christianity, and his conversion was total. He not only took the name Christian Naiche, he named one of his sons Christian Naiche Jr., and he began writing these beautiful hymns for the church. And this, I don't know, I don't want to put Bill Bradford on the spot. I don't know what it translates to. I think this first word means Apache in their language. It means people in the, but I don't know what the rest means. But it's the title of the song he wrote. Maybe Bill could translate that. But at any rate, he wrote these hymns. This is one that survives, and on the left side is this hymn in the Apache language, and on the right is the translation. I've never heard the music that went to it. That's one of the things I would really like to hear, is a song played with the music, but at least you could read the words. The Apaches raised horses, and they had a reputation there at Mescalero for their beautiful horse herd. And this was taken in the Whitetail Canyon area of Mescalero in 1915. This photograph is a detail of another photograph, and there was an elderly Apache woman. She was the last of the prisoners of war to die in 2006. Her name was Evelyn Gaines, and she said the tall Apache in the center with his back to the camera is Naiche, and there appears to be a white man taking his photograph. It'd be interesting to get that verified. Naiche took to painting these beautiful scenes on deer hides, and they exist today. Some are in the Smithsonian Institute, some are in private collections. They're extremely valuable, but he did such really, really beautiful work. And they all had names. The acorn hide had these acorn paintings on top, and they had the mountain god dancers and the wiki-ups and butterflies and things like that on them. The cholla had the cholla cactus on top, hummingbirds and horses, and a lot of these appear to be maybe some of the coming of age ceremonies. This is a really interesting one. It's not as colorful as the others, and you can't see it really clearly, but there's a line of white soldiers from behind cover, and across from them are the Apaches, and they're firing at each other. So Naiche painted a scene of one of the battles from years and years before, and he put himself into the painting and signed his name under it. We're going to take a close-up look at it. That says Naiche underneath the figure on the left. But who does that look like to his right? To me, he captured Geronimo to a T, and they always ran together for the most part during his years as when he was, quote, a hostile. So I thought even for caricatures, he was able to get the features perfect. Okay, here's the numbers we're talking about. There were 163 Chiricahua Apaches that went to Mescalero, and 78 chose to remain at Fort Sill. Now, the Army did not count the women and children. This is just the men. So we don't have the exact numbers, but there were 163 men and 78. 163 went to Mescalero and 78 Fort Sill. Among that who went to Mescalero were Naiche, Chato, Martin, Pieta, and Keatene. Some of those who stayed at Fort Sill were Jason Betsinas and Mangus. And then Geronimo, Nana, Loco, Chihuahua, Olzana, they all died as POWs before they were granted their freedom. Naiche himself passed away in March of 1919. He died of tuberculosis. So many Apaches died of respiratory type ailments and diseases. But that's what claimed his life. And it's interesting how so many books on the Apaches have his date of his year of death as 1921. I don't know how that started, including Ed Sweeney's book from Cochise to Geronimo, which is about the best book on the subject. But they make that mistake of his year of death as 1919. But he passed away in 1921, and he was given a military headstone since he was a scout. As ironic as that may sound, and here it is engraved in the whitetail section of Mescalero, Christian Naiche, Sergeant, 7th U.S. Cavalry. Here's his son, Christian Naiche Jr., as an adult. Unfortunately, I believe he only lived to be about 35 or something like that. Here's a photograph of Naiche's, one of his grandsons, who also, he was only in his early 40s. I may be wrong about this. Seems like I heard he died in a car wreck, alcohol related. But at any rate, he served in the Korean War, and here he is in this really sharp-looking Army uniform. I believe he was the rank of colonel. And what's that? Corporal. I'm sorry, corporal. If anybody could identify that patch, I never served in the military. My career was in law enforcement, but I'm kind of researching this and kind of curious as to.
It's First Armored Division, from what I remember. I think that's what it is.
Thank you. Yep. Thank you, Bill. I appreciate it. I should have known you would know. First Armored Division.
Yeah.
And this photo was taken in Korea. So that concludes my presentation. I want to mention Alicia Delgadillo, who gave me some of the old photographs and that really interesting telegram, and Craig McCune, who did the majority of the PowerPoint, and Cindy LaRussa, who's sitting right here, kind of updated the PowerPoint for me. They did a wonderful job, and I want to thank you all for watching tonight, and thank you all for asking me to be here, and I'll be happy to take any questions. I believe they said the questions were coming on the chats, so we may have to wait. But Bill, you have your mute.
Please say that again.
I said you have your mute off.
It's off now.
I'm hearing a bad echo. You hear that echo, Bill?
It echoes.
Bill, I heard that you wrote the Constitution for the Chiricahua tribe.
That's right. I don't want to bother you with the echo. I don't know what to do.
Oh, Bill, I think you are muted again. You may want to unmute yourself.
I'm unmuted.
Oh, I'm sorry. Bill, Speaker Bill is, I think
Oh,
he's
okay.
muted himself.
Okay.
Okay, you hear me now?
Yep, you're back.
Okay, how long have I been unmuted? Since the first slide?
No, just like the last minute.
Oh, okay. Well, I was speaking with Bill Bradford. He's a descendant of Naiche, and you mentioned that Preston Naiche was the 1st Armored Division. Was that right? Good. Thank you for clearing that up. I'd be happy to take any questions at this point. Please move this window away from the shared application. What does that mean, Cindy? You're my IT person.
I mean, at the very top, you can stop sharing. You'll see like it's a green thing at the very top.
I got it.
There you go.
Ah, okay. I see a bunch of people. Now, how are the chat questions going to come to me?
So far there are no questions in chat. If anyone wants to ask a question, I guess they could also just unmute themselves and ask.
Okay. I would ask they raise their hand because it kind of looks like the Brady Bunch on steroids. You know, there's like a whole bunch of people in front of me. So if you have a question, raise your hand. Okay, Bill, go ahead. Bill Bradford.
If you can hear me without the echo, good. So I would like you to reflect on this if you would. You used the word surrender, and I can understand why that word would be used. We have a different perspective on it. We were always people who could disappear and then reappear. And the idea that we would somehow manage to be herded onto a train, all of us, and then taken away, that wasn't how it happened. Certainly the Bedunkohe and Geronimo's group, they went on trains. But even then I would submit it was not a surrender, more than a decision made in the interests of the women and children to perpetuate their existence rather than continue to fight. I'm not going to say we were exactly like the Japanese, but the idea of surrendering was not something we did. We did stop fighting, some of us, for the benefit of others, but we did not all surrender, and we consider ourselves the Chiricahua Apache Nation unsurrendered.
Good point. I've actually heard that before, and I've also heard that they agreed to meet with the military to save their people. Yeah. Thank you for bringing that up. And now everybody can hear both myself and the people asking the questions. Is that right? Okay.
Yes,
Yeah,
they can.
a lot of people nodding their heads. Okay. Thank you, Bill. I appreciate that. Raise your hand if you have another question.
Deb, do you have a question? I see you're unmuted.
I see Robert Anthony. Robert, you have a question?
Not so much a question, but a reiteration of what Bill said. Those are the same stories that my mom would tell me, is that our people just vanished into the mountains and blended in with wherever they could.
Yeah. I also have historians tell me that every single Chiricahua Apache was accounted for when they were sent off as prisoners of war, and I just can't accept that. I just don't accept that. The Bronco Apaches were around for quite a bit longer, into the early 1930s for sure, and I'm sure well past that. Any other questions?
Oh yeah, we have one here from Annette Gray. She wants to know if Naiche's grandson, Preston, is still living.
No, he passed away. You knew a little bit about him, Bill. Do you know any more about Preston Naiche?
From what I know, he died of cirrhosis of the liver, and it was about 40 or 50 years ago. It wasn't recent.
Okay.
But you know, there are a number of descendants. He was very prolific, and the grandchildren were prolific. So there's a good many of us, and yeah, that's the best I know.
Could you tell me again your Chiricahua name?
Tuayese.
Thank you very much.
Tuayese. It means swims after his horses.
Well, I'll be darned. Okay, good
Yeah.
deal.
Yeah.
Other questions? There was smart
Yeah, I have-
answer. Deb?
Question, Deb here. Yeah, I just work somewhat at the Herd Museum, and I know we have an artifact from the family of Chief Loco, who was a contemporary of Geronimo's, I believe, if I remember right. Are you at all familiar with Chief Loco?
Oh, sure, sure. Loco, the peacemaker, they called him. He was of the
Right.
Chihene band with the Warm Springs. There's a fantastic book, a biography about him by Bud Shepard. I would recommend.
Right,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, you bet.
I just wanted to throw that in. Thank you.
Yeah. Just raise your hand if there's any more.
We have one in the chat. Have any of the Apache returned to the Chiricahuas?
As far as I know, none are living here. And Bill could correct me if I'm wrong. I've had some come over here and visit at my home and stay here at our cottages and go up to the Chiricahuas for religious purposes and to do some filmmaking and things like that. So they have returned. And I know between Las Cruces and Deming, there's a restaurant, and I think they have long-term plans for making it a casino and things like that.
If I might add, for the benefit of those listening, we own land in the Dragoons, and we make ceremonies in the Chiricahuas and the Dragoons. We have one coming up in April.
Yeah, that's
So
right.
we frequent the area, and we're buying more land there. Our headquarters is in Fort Baird in New Mexico, but the range in the Dragoons and the Chiricahuas is part of our claim area, and we assert sovereignty over it. And the federal government used to recognize it by treaty. We're encouraging them to return to the respectful acknowledgement that they agreed to. So yes, we're here.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
Can you tell us about the people that interpreted for them and what languages they used, whether they all used the Cherokee language or whether they used Spanish or English?
A lot of the Chiricahuas spoke Spanish. In fact, when Cochise first met Howard, they were conversing a little bit in Spanish back and forth. I don't know how fluent he was. I get a lot of people, and Bill, you may run into this too. Oh, my grandfather was a soldier, and he used to sit on a bench with Geronimo, and they would go to town together and chat. And I would ask them, well, who was the interpreter? And they would say, well, what do you mean? I said, well, he didn't speak much English, so you kind of have to dispel those myths. But I hate to keep going back to you, Bill. But could you answer that more in detail about did they all speak the same dialect?
So, well, the languages are so close that it's more of a geographic thing of the 4 different bands. So it's we can all understand each other, but oftentimes Spanish was spoken to the one person who knew English, who would translate either Chiricahua into English or Spanish into English. That was the common thing. Goyatle, he learned English, especially after being at Fort Sill. But at the times of the negotiations, they would usually have Spanish, and the Army would have someone that spoke Spanish, and that's how they would, by a chain, communicate.
In fact, there were 2 translators, one who translated from Apache to Spanish, and another who translated from Spanish to English. So it was kind of awkward.
Yeah.
Okay, I think we have a follow-up in the chat to asking about if the Apache returned to the Chiricahuas. She said, I was told that the spirits of the ancestors live in the boulders. Can William comment?
William Bradford, not me.
Yeah, assuming William Bradford.
We have a monotheistic concept of God. We call it Yusen. God is Yusen. And then there are mountain spirits who are intercessors who appear and help us. They cut through the danger, they cut through the disorder, the chaos, and they protect us. But they're not inhabitants per se of boulders or the mountains, but they come from the mountains. So to that extent, if you want to think of it in those terms, but we think of it a little bit more broadly than that. They are of the mountains, not specifically in a piece of rock, if that makes any sense. So I think, does that answer the question?
She says thank you, so I guess so.
Okay.
Before I forget, I was asked to do this. I don't want to appear that I'm plugging my book, but I was asked to show it before everyone leaves. There were some people interested in purchasing it. It's called the Chiricahua Apaches, A Concise History. It's published by Eco Publishing, and there's some great people over at the Chiricahua Desert Museum near Rodeo, New Mexico, and they have that website, chiricahuadesertmuseum.com, and you could go to that website, and you can find the Eco Publishing there. And if you're interested in purchasing the book, you could find it there, and maybe talk to Bob Ashley, the publisher, and he could help you out with any questions. That looks like that may be it. Oh, okay, we have somebody waving. Are you saying goodbye, or you have a question? You're muted, I can't hear you.
I don't see who it is. What's the first name?
It's Jean.
Oh, okay.
It's Jean, right. Well, we want to thank Bill so much for being with us tonight. I think we all learned a great deal tonight. We really appreciate it. We want you to watch our website. You can find us at TucsonPresidio.com. We have an awful lot of things going on because the museum is mostly outside. We are able to hold events during this COVID crisis. So do kind of check us out and see what's going on down there. We hope you're going to join us next month for Stan Martin talking about the Rodeo Parade Museum. Like I say, he's not 96 years old, but the Tucson Parade Museum, the Tucson Parade is 96. So, but we want to really thank all of you for coming. This was our largest Zoom meeting that we have done. So Bill, you brought in all kinds of good people to us. So we're really, really appreciate it. And until we can all meet in person once again, we are delighted that you could be with us. Please join us again next month for our next one. Good night, everybody. And thank you so much for coming. Thanks, Bill, ever so much.
Thank you, Bill. I owe you one.
Oh, thanks so very much. Thanks, Bill.
Bye.
Okay.
Thank you for attending, everyone.